guys, we're going to keep moving through and trucking on with the disorders content. This one is going to be very content heavy with these dissociative and personality disorders. There will be a lot of different examples within these categories. We're going to make sure that we do a lot of work in class to get you guys familiar with them, to feel like you can be prepared for the AP test. Just know that while I'm going to go quickly through these, we will do them more in depth in class with one another, and you won't feel nearly as overwhelmed, okay? So let's talk about dissociative disorders first, okay? This is characterized by separations of parts of your personality in the sense that memories, consciousness, identity can split and end up working kind of separately rather than being integrated and working together, okay? So people that dissociate, they're able to prevent and ultimately avoid really unpleasant memories or perceptions from making it to their conscious level of awareness. So that ends up reducing their anxiety over those things. The thing that a lot of people fail to recognize is dissociative disorders, especially once we start talking about DID, for example, where people are just like, how is it possible for an individual to have multiple personalities? We actually have dissociative states quite frequently. For example, anytime that you kind of split your conscious level of awareness and you are, getting up in the morning, for example, you leave your house, you get here to school, you park in your parking space, you turn out the keys, and you just sit there and say to yourself, wow, I don't remember getting here. I know I'm here. I know I left my house. I know I'm fine. But I don't have any memory of getting from point A to point B. That's a dissociative episode. We can split our conscious level of awareness fairly frequently, even as normal functioning individuals. Now, when you have DID, for example, or dissociative fugue, those are the two that I'm going to spend the most time talking about from this category today. These aren't the only ones. It's a little bit more overwhelming and far more prevalent and more severe when those dissociative episodes happen. So let's talk DID, okay? Dissociative identity disorder. This is a condition where a person has two or more personalities within them. That's right. Those personalities have different speech patterns, handwritings, memories, genders. They all speak, act, write differently. Okay, they have different people within them, and that's a very strange thing for people to wrap their brains around. Those different identities have various different, basically they serve different purposes. The different identities are called alters, and they have their own wishes and impulses that can oftentimes end up conflicting with some of the other identities that are present within an individual with DID. And so what creates the problem ultimately for this circumstance is that a person has only one body physiologically, but if you've got all of these different personalities, that forces them to take turns with one another, okay? And so there end up being very strong variations in personalities and in the person's behavior overall, and so that can seem very strange to individuals. It's not out of the ordinary for you to see situations, for example, of someone being perceived as being bipolar with these personalities, because they seem to be, like a more calm, responsible personality maybe at one point, and then they suddenly seem to switch to somebody that demonstrates kind of quote-unquote manic tendencies too. So DID is a pretty fascinating set of circumstances, not the least of which being the fact that it's actually a disorder that to this day continues to be debated over as to whether the number of cases that have been diagnosed are truly legitimate. That's going to get tabled for a little bit, though. So famous cases of DID would be that of Chris Sizemore, whose situation was made famous in the movie The Three Faces of Eve that came out in the 1950s. Chris has 22 different personalities. 3 of those were presented in the book and the movies. And so the famous characterizations of them are presented as Eve. It's not out of the ordinary for the different alters to have very similar names to one another. So you've got Eve White, Eve Black, and then Jane, who was one of the other personalities that was presented in Sizemore's circumstances. If you are someone who is really big into football, Herschel Walker, who is a Heisman Trophy winning football player who played for the University of Georgia, went on to the NFL, had a pretty illustrious career there too. He ended up coming out and detailing in a book his battle with multiple personalities as well. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that circumstance in class with one another. But here's the thing. When it comes to other famous cases, it's important to take a look at Shirley Mason, who kind of touched off an awful lot of the study of DID. She had an alter named Sybil. Mason was a sub and a student at Columbia, and seemed to just kind of have issues with blackouts, and just seemed to kind of be all over the place in terms of emotional expressions and things. Ended up going to psychotherapy with a woman named Cornelia Wilbur, and she was very heavily influenced by psychoanalytic, psychodynamic perspective, her psychiatrist. And so their sessions ended up being the book, or becoming the basis for the book Sybil, which ended up becoming a TV movie as well and becoming fairly famous. Mason moved to Lexington and ended up teaching art classes, and ran an art gallery out of her home for many, many, many years. But you can see the differentiations even just here in terms of the art between some of her different alters. So all told, here they are. Notice that I've mentioned how there are some that have similar names to one another. Please note differentiations in gender, in how they perceive themselves in terms of physical appearance. Make no mistake, how these alters perceive themselves in their presentation is how they see themselves physiologically, and that's something that students often struggle to be able to wrap their brains around. How could you, for example, Ms. Hogel, if you had multiple personalities and one of them was male, when you look in a mirror, how could you not see a female? And that's ultimately part of that dissociative break. Consciously, they don't perceive that. They see themselves as who they view themselves to be in their mind. And that's an important thing to recognize. Different theories are going to look at DID and explain it in different ways, just as every approach is going to explain behaviors differently. If you go from, Cornelia Wilbur and other psychoanalysts, it's going to be a repression of memories and unwanted situations, traumas that occurred in early childhood. It's not uncommon for you to see circumstances of child abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, to lead to developments of DID. My former intro students will remember, or any former intro student will remember, Kim Noble. I'm going to talk about her story again when we get together in class. She has over 100 different personalities, and she dealt with an awful lot of abuse when she was a child. So what these individuals do, according to psychoanalysis, is operate on a pretty hardcore defense mechanism of repression by creating this brand new person that ends up acting out these kind of unwanted impulses, or kind of helps them to avoid the unbearable memories that they have and that they've experienced. With behaviorists, the argument is ultimately that the symptoms are strengthened by reward. If you look at it in the sense of the fact that these alters are helping a person to avoid the unpleasantness of anxiety, to avoid reliving painful memories and parts of their past, that's negative reinforcement. So you're going to continue to shift those personalities if it allows you to escape the stress or the trauma of what you went through when you were young, or whatever caused those different identities to develop. When we truly look at the scenario of DID, it's really hard because it's a pretty rare disorder. True legitimate diagnosable cases of DID are very rare. There was kind of like this big blow up in the 1990s of an awful lot of DID cases, and there were many who ended up kind of attacking members of the psychological field, saying, you guys are just creating this for a whole bunch of people who are clearly disturbed but don't have this because you want money to be able to kind of bilk them out of time to have to constantly come in and work with you. Here's the thing. Most clinicians believe, even with the rarity of the presentation of DID out there, that the root cause is abuse or trauma that occurred during childhood. It's one of the few disorders that we know of that doesn't seem to have a biological cause to it, say like we would see with depression or anxiety disorder or something. Basically, what the belief is for what causes this is simply just that a kid doesn't know how to cope with the trauma that they're experiencing because they are a child. They're just not capable of looking at things in that kind of higher level lens, and so they separate or split their personalities to deal with what they're experiencing in that traumatic moment. Okay, let's talk real fast about dissociative fugue real fast. It's a funny word, I know. It's also called fugue state. Basically what happens with dissociative fugue is a person just very suddenly, without warning, loses all memory of their prior life, and they take on a completely different kind of identity. It's possible for a person to just wake up one day, have no idea who they are. There's a lot of debate, for example, that famous author Agatha Christie had a dissociative fugue episode after it came to light that her husband had been cheating on her and her marriage was essentially dissolving. She ended up going to this kind of retreat or spa place for several weeks, going by a completely different name, completely different identity, and she never ended up addressing the event by any means. And so there are some psychologists and scholars who believe that she might have had a dissociative state because of the stress that the failure of her marriage evoked from her. The thing to recognize with those with dissociative fugue is that they can function pretty normally. They just don't remember their previous life. And so if you're just meeting someone with this dissociative fugue, with this amnesia state, you're not going to know that they necessarily were a completely different person before that point, because they might not even remember that they were a completely different person before that point. Okay, let's switch gears now, and we're going to start talking about personality disorders. This is where things are going to start to get a little bit more complex. DID is pretty straightforward. There's only 2 subsets to that category that we focus on. Here in personality disorders, there's an awful lot more, and many of these you're actually pretty familiar with, you just don't realize that you are. Here's the thing. We look at personality disorders as traits within a person's personality that are, excuse me, I'm trying to suppress the yawn there, long-standing. They have been prevalent in that person for an extensive period of time, and they are highly inflexible. They just don't change. They are very rigid and rigidly set in that person's personality. They also have to impair their social functioning. Okay, so it seems like a very vague descriptor, but we ultimately cluster personality disorders into 3 groups. Okay, you've got cluster A, which is where an individual will exhibit and express very odd or eccentric, very outside of the norm, or severe kind of behaviors. Cluster B is where a person has the tendency to be really emotionally erratic or dramatic. And then you've got cluster C, which is where the person shows highly anxious and fearful behavior. I'll go through each one of these individual disorders, and we'll get to that, especially individually, one-on-one. When kids see that there's an obsessive compulsive personality disorder, they sit there and look at me and say, well, how does that differ from just regular obsessive compulsive disorder? So we'll get through all of these. But I would highly recommend that you make sure that you know which of these disorders go with which cluster, because it's entirely possible that they will ask you that on the AP test. Here's an interesting note to keep in mind for yourself when we cover these personality disorders. And I made mention to it when we were doing our intro notes, but it bears some significance of repeating. Those who have personality disorders are often going to seek treatment not because they perceive that they have a problem, but because others perceive that they have a problem. Either a court orders them to seek out treatment, i.e., someone with antisocial personality disorder, or someone from their family ends up pushing them and pressuring them to seek therapy because they themselves, the others in their lives, are distressed by the behaviors that are presented with those disorders. All right, so let's talk about these guys individually, okay? Paranoid personality disorder is exactly as it sounds. A person with this disorder has constant levels of suspiciousness, mistrust of others. They perceive that you are trying to exploit and deceive them, okay? They do not perceive that anyone is trustworthy in any way, shape, or form. They will confide in no one, and that if they were to confide in you, that is going to be used to be manipulated and to stab them in the back. Okay, they're always suspicious and mistrustful of anybody who is in their life. Schizoid disorder is one that's not as well known, but you have probably seen some demonstrations of these behaviors in TV and movies, and we'll talk about that in class. Schizoid disorder is where a person has high levels of detachment from social relationships. So this isn't the sense of like antisocial personality disorder, which we'll talk about in a second. Those with schizoid have difficulty expressing their emotions when trying to communicate with others, and so that's why they don't have a tendency to connect well with other people. They lack a desire for intimacy. They just don't perceive it as holding a level of significance, and they're going to avoid close relationships with others. This is kind of that scenario where you would see an individual kind of perceived as a loner in that regard. Schizotypal, on the other hand, it sounds similar, but it's not. I'm going to move myself out of the way for a second so you can get this info. Schizotypal is when a person struggles with high levels of suspiciousness and hostility toward others, and also ends up struggling with relationships. So to a lot of students, it sounds really similar to schizoid because they isolate themselves, they're distant from others. But here's the thing. Schizotypal is found far more in families that have struggles with schizophrenia, because it is possible for an individual with schizotypal to have perceptual distortions, like seeing flashes of light that no one else can see. For schizotypal individuals, they fear people, and that's ultimately why they distance themselves. With schizoid personalities, they just don't value interacting with other individuals. They just don't care to interact with you. And so that's the key defining differentiation between these two terms that tend to sound very similar to students. All right, let's talk cluster B real fast. Antisocial personality disorder. This is probably the most well-known personality disorder out there because of all the work that is done on serial killers, because many of them end up being diagnosed with APD. You have to have at least 3 of the following present in your personality. Those with APD do not conform to laws. They will break them. They will repeatedly commit crimes because they don't think that laws apply to them. They are deceitful in relationships. They will manipulate you. They will con you out of things. It's very common for you to see con artists who end up having antisocial personality disorder. It's not just creepy serial killers that have it. They have high levels of impulsivity. They just don't tend to plan ahead. They struggle with being able to keep down a job, for example, because of that impulsivity. It's also not terribly exciting to them either. High levels of anger and aggression can be present in an individual. They can get into repeated fights or assaults, and they just don't care about their safety or other people's safety. They don't have the capacity to place themselves in your shoes and see how their actions affect you. APD can't be diagnosed until you are into your late teen years. But to be diagnosed with APD, you have to have shown symptoms since 15 years of age, okay? Oftentimes what ends up happening is a person has a diagnosis of conduct disorder before the APD diagnosis, and we'll talk about that with some of the disruptive disorders content that I'll get into with you guys in a little bit of a later video. They've had these struggles for a while, okay? So even though the diagnosis doesn't come until you are, into your teen years, that doesn't mean that those behaviors are not present from well earlier on in their childhood behaviors, because they very much tend to be. APD is far more diagnosed in males than females. That doesn't mean that females do not get antisocial personality disorder. But it's also important to note that sociopath or psychopath tends to be very interchangeably used with someone with APD, but you've got to be careful with that because not everyone with antisocial personality disorder is a sociopath. And psychopaths are like the highest of the high in terms of the antisocial personality tendencies. It is possible for some individuals with APD to experience some level of empathy or sympathy, although they don't tend to demonstrate those behaviors. So you got to be careful when you use those terms. Don't just throw them around willy-nilly. In terms of cause for APD, we do think that there might be a genetic predisposition. There seems to be a link with a genetic mutation called the warrior gene, or the MOMA gene, that links to causing underdeveloped amygdala activity and issues with regard to frontal cortex. functioning, specifically the prefrontal cortex or the orbital cortex. So that leads to low levels of anxiety, low level of emotional expression in general. So it makes them less sensitive to punishment, less sensitive to feeling bad for or guilt for their actions. Others argue that there has to be some kind of, environmental factor to this, that yes, you might have some genetic predisposition, but some life experiences have to pull this stuff out. So this is kind of where that diathesis stress model can come back into play again. A lot of research shows that terrible home lives, whether it be broken home, rejection by parents, poor discipline, lack of good parenting models, lack of attachment to caregivers in early childhood, those can all kind of play a role in causing those behaviors to develop into an adult later on. They did a ton of research on PET scans of those who were incarcerated for murder that showed an awful lot of that lack of frontal lobe functioning that I made mention to just a little bit ago. And so that is a very important thing to take a look at. If you see here in terms of a normal functioning PET scan, there's lots of activity here in that frontal lobe that deals with personality development, judgment control, impulse control, emotion control, planning. It's just not as active here in those with APD. And so there are many that point to that as a significant sign of why they behave the way they do. So let's talk about borderline personality disorder real fast. This is highly unstable and intense interpersonal relationship problems, self-perception problems, mood problems. Okay, their impulse control is very impaired as well. Things that you'll see from somebody who has BPD, lots of unstable responses to personal relationships. They are going to idealize someone and be like, oh my God, I am so in love with you, I cannot spend enough time with you, and then very, very quickly after that, it will be, I can't stand you, I hate you, get out of my life, I don't want to spend any time with you whatsoever. They're going to have very distorted and unstable self-image. Things are very black and white for them. And at the same time, they're going to continue to jump from one crisis or piece of drama to the next. It just constantly has to be present there. High levels of impulsive behavior, things like reckless driving, underage drinking, excessive spending. And many of these things are going to sound very similar to bipolar disorder, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, because they are two very distinctly different disorders. Histrionic personality disorder is another type within this cluster. And the best example that I can give for a histrionic personality type would be the one and only Michael Scott from The Office, for anyone who's familiar with that. Histrionic personality disorder is very much categorized by this overwhelming excessive need for approval and attention, okay? So people with this disorder feel constant needs for excitement. They get very bored by routine. They're uncomfortable when they're not the center of attention, and they just need all the time this incessant reassurance and approval from other people. Okay, they're going to seek out lots of excitement simply just because they desperately want you to be paying attention to them. If you are familiar with The Office, then looking at Michael Scott would be a pretty good demonstration of this tendency, simply just because much of his antics tend to be demonstrating his overwhelming desire to have people pay attention to him, to love him, to perceive him, for example, as the world's best boss here, and to be the center of attention and just incredibly well-liked and things along those lines. Now, let's talk about narcissistic personality disorder to round out this cluster. Narcissistic personality is exactly what it sounds like. It's a person who is just overwhelmingly self-absorbed. They are completely full of themselves. They have this feeling that the world cannot exist or people cannot function without them being around and without their involvement. Okay, so they demand constant attention as well, and they feel entitled to special favors because they are just so important and so needed that you should be helping them, giving them special favors accordingly. Like Regina George. I mean, obviously she's I don't know that she would be a full-fledged demonstration of NPD, but she does demonstrate some pretty narcissistic tendencies sometimes in the movie Mean Girls. Nevertheless, something else to kind of take a look at with regard to narcissistic personality disorder, and this has been kind of on the rise in terms of a diagnosis, is it's present a lot in your generation because of selfies and just social media in general. If you think about it, the entire point behind social media is pay attention to me, 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 me. I'm going to take a picture of my dinner and post it on Facebook or Instagram, and I expect you guys to give me like a certain number of likes. If I don't get those, if I don't get like, you know, all my hearts that I want or anything along those lines, then that's not acceptable, and people need to be paying more attention to me. You know, if you think about all that goes into taking a selfie to begin with, it has a tendency to demonstrate some pretty narcissistic leanings. Not trying to put any of you guys on blast for doing those things if you do complete selfies and whatnot, but you know, just the pout or the angle or trying to find the right filter or anything along those lines, just so that way you can send a picture of yourself, of your face, for other people to respond to, is just, you know, it's very self-centered in terms of its tendencies. Okay. So let's move on to cluster C then, wrap this stuff up, and talk about this final group of personality disorders. First one is avoidant personality within cluster C. It's exactly like it sounds. These people just have a very overwhelming feeling of inadequacy, and so because of that, they're very sensitive to what others think about them, and so they will try to avoid scenarios where socializing or interacting happens because they feel very overwhelmed by those circumstances and feel inadequate as a result of whatever kind of perceived flaws that they happen to have. They're very sensitive to what your perception of them would be. So because of that, they're going to be very inhibited. They'll come off as kind of socially awkward as well. And they're going to be kind of restrictive in things because they just are afraid of what you are going to end up thinking about them. Dependent personality disorder is when a person feels the need and the necessity to be taken care of, and that oftentimes ends up coinciding with creating very either submissive or super clingy kinds of behaviors. There's a high fear of separation that occurs there. Basically, in a dependent personality type, there is this very connected desire to have to be connected with somebody. I'm kind of just stumbling over my words here. I'm trying to come up with synonyms for you guys since I know that I'm such a big proponent of those things without using the word in my explanations. But ultimately, with a dependent personality type, they have this perception that they cannot function on their own without this other individual or without the help of other people. Even when it comes to just making everyday decisions. You know, to kind of draw a parallel to this, it's often been presented that Bella from Twilight is a dependent personality, and possibly could have dependent personality disorder with how clingy she could be toward Edward with regard to their relationship or things along those lines. So if you just know that a dependent personality type is excessively clingy, or just feels this need to rely on others constantly because they perceive themselves as being incapable of doing things without that person, you've got dependent down pretty well. Then we go to obsessive compulsive personality disorder. How does this differ from OCD? Well, you don't have the compulsive rituals that are present in the personality disorder that you do in OCD. Okay, so when you're talking about individuals that have OCD, where they feel the need because of their, their concerns with germs, they have to wash their hands, things along those lines. That's not present in someone with a personality disorder of obsessive compulsive tendencies. For those with OCPD, what you've got is a preoccupation with things like detail, order, organization, schedules, very rigid with regard to those, and expectations of rules. Their underlying anxiety is fear of a lack of control in their life, to a point where they have to have neatness and order and organization to everything. And so that tends to lend them toward being pretty emotionally sensitive. They're very inflexible. They're not willing to make adjustments to aspects of their life because of that. And so ultimately, that's how you could be diagnosed with obsessive compulsive personality disorder rather than obsessive compulsive disorder, which is kind of under more of a blanket of an anxiety disorder component. So this is the end of the dissociative and personality disorder video notes. We're going to make sure that you're all situated when we get into class activities, doing some case studies, differentiating between these guys to help you. But as always, if you have any questions, just let me know.